The courtroom was filled with a low murmur as the jury took their seats, and the lawyers shuffled their papers, ready for the trial to begin. It was a busy day at the courthouse. People walked in and out, the usual clattering of heels echoing through the halls. But inside this particular courtroom, the air was thick with tension. This wasn't just another trial. This was something different, something the judge wasn't prepared for. Judge Alan Matthews was an experienced man, one who had spent years in the legal system. He had seen his fair share of criminals, some guilty, others innocent, but all deserving of a fair trial. Today's case was one he had been assigned to for weeks. It was serious. A man was accused of embezzling millions of dollars, betraying the trust of countless people in the process. It was a complicated case, filled with long hours of paperwork and the weight of justice hanging over the defendant's head. But none of this mattered at the moment. There was something more pressing on Judge Matthews' mind. As the defendant was brought into the courtroom, his face covered by the handcuffs that marked his shame, Judge Matthews stared at him, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. The man before him didn't look like the boy from his past. No, the man standing trial today seemed like someone completely different, a stranger. But then, their eyes met. The days that followed were filled with tension. Each day, the trial progressed, and Judge Matthews found himself more and more consumed by the complexity of the case. The evidence against David Turner seemed overwhelming. The prosecution had gathered financial records, witness testimonies, and even emails that suggested David had been involved in a large-scale embezzlement operation, funneling millions of dollars from his company into offshore accounts. The accusations were serious, and the people who had been harmed by David's actions were everywhere: investors who had lost their life savings, families whose futures had been ruined, employees who had lost their jobs. Each time David was presented in the courtroom, sitting there in his ill-fitting suit, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on him, Judge Matthews found himself struggling to reconcile the man before him with the boy he had once known. The next few days in court felt like an emotional roller coaster for Judge Matthews. Each day, new revelations came to light, and every piece of evidence seemed to add another layer to the mystery of David Turner's involvement in the crimes he was accused of. The pressure was building, not just from the courtroom, but from within the judge himself. The more he heard, the more the lines between right and wrong blurred in his mind. Could David truly be guilty of all this? Or was he merely a victim of circumstances that had spiraled out of his control? The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with an energy unlike any before. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. After weeks of intense testimony and growing tension, everyone knew that today would bring closure, one way or another. The weight of the past weeks was heavy on Judge Matthews as he walked into the courtroom. His heart beat a little faster than usual, his thoughts still clouded with doubt and uncertainty. How could he possibly make the right decision in a case like this? The facts seemed clear: David Turner had committed the crimes he was accused of. But the circumstances surrounding those actions were not as simple. David sat quietly at the defense table, his eyes downcast, his body tense. The once confident man who had spoken so freely in his youth now appeared defeated, his every movement heavy with regret. He had been a man caught in a web that he couldn't escape from, trapped by forces that had threatened everything he loved. And yet, there was still the question of his accountability. Could a person be blamed for actions they had been forced to take under duress? Could a person who had been manipulated into crime by fear and intimidation still be held to the same standards as someone who had committed those crimes willingly? Judge Matthews had seen many criminals in his career, but none had shaken him like this. This case wasn't just about the law, it was about the man in front of him, a man he had once called a friend. The familiar face from his childhood had been replaced by someone who seemed a world apart, someone who was both a victim and a perpetrator. It was a complex puzzle, and Judge Matthews wasn't sure he had all the pieces. The prosecution's case had been solid. They had presented the evidence, the financial records, the witness testimonies, and the facts were undeniable. David had stolen millions, and his actions had caused a ripple effect that had affected many innocent people. Families had lost their savings, employees had lost their jobs, and the trust that had once been in David had been shattered. The victims in the case deserved justice, and that was the law. Judge Matthews knew that. But as the defense had pointed out, there was a larger story to tell, a story that hadn't been heard yet. David had been coerced, manipulated by powerful people who had threatened his family, people who had controlled his every move. The judge couldn't ignore the fact that David hadn't acted alone. He had been trapped in a dangerous situation, with no easy way out. The defense had argued that David was not the mastermind behind the operation, that he had been an unwilling participant, forced into making choices that went against everything he had believed in. The judge thought back to the moment when David had spoken so openly in court about his fears, his regrets, and the threats against his family. Those words had been raw and honest, and for the first time, the judge saw David for who he really was, a man who had made mistakes, yes, but a man who had been pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond his control. Judge Matthews had known David to be a kind person, someone who cared deeply for others. He couldn't reconcile the man he had once known with the one standing trial in front of him. The decision he had to make felt like a weight pressing down on him. He knew that whatever he decided, it would have lasting consequences. David had committed a crime, there was no denying that. But how could the law punish someone who had been forced into that situation? How could the judge ignore the emotional plea David had made, the look of fear in his eyes as he described the threats against his family? As the final arguments were presented, Judge Matthews found himself torn between the law and his own emotions. The law told him that David had broken it, and punishment was inevitable. But his conscience whispered something else. Was it possible to find a middle ground, a way to bring justice while also considering the unique circumstances that had led to this point? The room fell silent as Judge Matthews stood, his gaze moving over the faces in the courtroom. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of his decision. Everyone was waiting for his verdict. It was time. With a deep breath, Judge Matthews began to speak. "This case is unlike any I have ever presided over," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "The evidence against the defendant is clear. David Turner has committed serious crimes, and there is no question that his actions have caused harm to many people. The law is the law, and it must be upheld." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "But," Judge Matthews continued, his voice unwavering, "the law does not exist in a vacuum. It is not just about punishing the guilty. It is also about understanding the circumstances in which those actions were taken. There are times when the law must bend, when we must consider the human element, the emotions, the fears, and the motivations behind the choices we make." David lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the judge's. For the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. He had been expecting the worst. He had come to terms with the idea that he might never see the outside world again. But now, the judge's words were giving him a chance, something he hadn't expected. "I do not take lightly the crimes committed," Judge Matthews said, his voice softer now. "David Turner, you broke the law, and you must be held accountable. But the question is, how do we hold you accountable for actions that were, in many ways, forced upon you? How do we balance justice with compassion?" He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The entire courtroom was silent, hanging on his every word. "I have decided," Judge Matthews continued, "that while the law must be enforced, it must also be tempered with understanding. David Turner will be sentenced to a term of probation, not prison, under the condition that he fully cooperate with the authorities to bring the people responsible for his coercion to justice. Furthermore, he will be required to repay the victims of his actions, working in a program designed to restore what was lost." The decision was met with stunned silence. The victims, sitting in the courtroom, exchanged surprised glances. Many had hoped for harsher punishment, but the judge's decision was far from what they had expected. David's fate had been altered, not by the harshness of the law, but by the compassion that had led Judge Matthews to see the deeper story. David looked down at his hands, overwhelmed by the judge's words. He had been given a chance he had never expected, and one that he would not waste. Judge Matthews took one last look at his childhood friend, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. It had not been an easy one, but in the end, he had done what he believed was right. Justice had been served, not with punishment, but with the possibility of redemption. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest form of justice anyone could ask for. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Judge Matthews remained seated, lost in thought. The case was over, but the questions it had raised would stay with him forever. He had learned that justice was not always clear-cut. It was sometimes messy, complicated, and full of gray areas. But in the end, it was about understanding the whole picture and offering people the chance to change when they truly sought it. The new witnesses that had come forward were more than just testimonies, they were proof that something far deeper was at play in this case. People who had worked with David at the company testified about secret meetings, strange phone calls, and unexpected demands from shadowy figures. The names of powerful individuals began to surface, individuals who were known to have connections to organized crime. Some witnesses described how David had been coerced into helping hide the stolen funds, claiming that his family had been threatened, and they painted a disturbing picture of how David had been manipulated over time. Sarah Clark, the defense attorney, seized on these developments, arguing that David had been a mere pawn in a much larger scheme. She suggested that the prosecution was focusing too heavily on David's role as the face of the operation, ignoring the bigger picture, the unseen forces that had controlled him. She painted a picture of a man who had been driven into a corner, unable to escape, forced into committing crimes that he never intended to commit. At first, Judge Matthews had been skeptical of this defense. But as the days went on, he began to see the truth in it. The evidence couldn't be ignored. David's role in the crime was undeniable, but the idea that he had been threatened, manipulated, and trapped was becoming harder to dismiss. There was one moment, during a particularly tense afternoon session, that the courtroom fell into an eerie silence. David, who had been sitting quietly for days, finally spoke up. His voice was hoarse, filled with emotion, as he addressed the court. "I didn't want any of this," David said, his eyes red from the sleepless nights and the weight of what was happening. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. But there were people who would have done worse to my family. I didn't know what else to do. They had everything on me, everything. They told me they would hurt them if I didn't comply. And I was scared." There was a hushed gasp in the courtroom as David's words sank in. The judge watched him closely, his heart heavy with the guilt of what he was hearing. For the first time, he saw something that he hadn't seen before, the vulnerability in his old friend's eyes. David wasn't the cold, calculating criminal the prosecution had painted him to be. He was someone who had been terrified, someone who had been manipulated into a life of crime by forces much larger than himself. Judge Matthews leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always known David to be a good person. He had known him as a boy full of promise and potential. Could this really be the same person, or had his life been completely shaped by the manipulations of others? As the trial continued, more and more details began to emerge about the criminal organization that had coerced David into doing their bidding. The prosecution's case, once rock solid, was now full of holes. The focus had shifted from David's actions to the people who had controlled him. The more the defense uncovered, the more the judge realized that David might not have been the mastermind behind the scheme after all. For the first time, Judge Matthews found himself questioning everything he had believed. He had always thought that justice was black and white, that the law was the law, and there was no room for emotion or personal bias. But here, in front of him, was a case that had no clear answer, no simple solution. The truth was complicated, messy, and far from what anyone had expected. The days turned into weeks, and the courtroom became a place of constant tension. The judge struggled to maintain his composure as he listened to the testimonies, each one more heartbreaking than the last. David's family, who had once been close to him, spoke about the fear and anxiety they had lived with, knowing that they were being watched by dangerous people. They described how David had tried to protect them, how he had kept his troubles to himself, afraid to bring them into the darkness he had been forced into. But despite the mounting evidence that David had been coerced, there was still the question of what to do next. The law was clear: David had broken the law. He had stolen millions of dollars, and there were victims whose lives had been ruined. But could he be held accountable for his actions when it was clear that he had been manipulated? Could someone who had been forced into a life of crime by threats and fear truly be punished in the same way as someone who had made the choice to commit those crimes? Judge Matthews had heard countless cases during his time on the bench, but none like this. He had dealt with murderers, thieves, and corrupt officials. He had sentenced many people to prison, some of them deserving, others caught up in a system that didn't always offer mercy. But this case, this trial, felt different. David wasn't just another defendant. He was a person with a past, a history, and a set of circumstances that couldn't be ignored. The judge spent sleepless nights poring over the evidence, trying to make sense of it all. He knew that his decision would have a profound impact, not just on David's life, but on the lives of those around him. There were victims who needed justice, people who had suffered because of David's actions. But there was also the question of redemption. Was there a way to offer David a chance to make amends for what he had done, or had he crossed a line that could never be undone? As the trial neared its conclusion, Judge Matthews knew that he would have to make a decision that would be difficult, one that would challenge his understanding of justice. Could he offer David the opportunity to turn his life around, to undo the damage that had been done? Or would the law demand that he pay the price for his actions, regardless of the circumstances? The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the final arguments were presented. The tension in the air was palpable. The fate of David Turner hung in the balance, and the judge knew that his decision would not be an easy one to make. As the judge prepared to give his verdict, he felt the weight of the responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about humanity, about compassion, and about the choices people make under pressure. And no matter what he decided, one thing was clear: this trial was far from over, and the consequences of his decision would resonate far beyond the walls David had always been so full of life. Back in school, he had been the one with the biggest ideas. He talked about running his own business, creating something that would change the world. He had dreams, just like everyone else, but he had ambition, a drive to make it big. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had taken a dark turn. Somewhere, those dreams had become tainted by greed, by choices that led him to this trial, accused of crimes that seemed so far removed from the man he had once known. But Judge Matthews wasn't ready to give up on David just yet. Despite the evidence piling up against him, despite the constant reminders of his guilt, the judge kept thinking back to their past, to the days when David was full of hope. Could he really be guilty of all these charges? Was it possible that David had changed so drastically? Or had there been something more to this story that no one could see? On the third day of the trial, the defense finally presented its case in full. Sarah Clark, David's lawyer, had been carefully building her arguments, trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case. She had painted a picture of a man who had been caught in a dangerous web, a man who hadn't acted alone but had been manipulated by forces beyond his control. She explained how David had been living a relatively modest life, despite his involvement in the company's financial dealings. There were no lavish homes or fancy cars, no signs that he had been indulging in the wealth he was accused of stealing. Sarah had argued that David had been coerced into committing the crimes by people in positions of power, people who had threatened his family, forced him into actions he didn't want to take. Judge Matthews listened carefully to Sarah's arguments. He couldn't ignore the fact that there might be some truth to what she was saying. After all, David hadn't been the kind of person to seek out wealth and power. He wasn't the type to use others for personal gain. But the idea of him being forced into a life of crime didn't sit well either. It was difficult to imagine, but then again, life had a way of surprising people. Maybe there was more to David's story than anyone had realized. Sarah continued, presenting evidence of phone records and emails that showed David had been in communication with people who were known to have ties to criminal organizations. Some of the emails hinted at threats, vague references to his family being in danger if he didn't comply with their demands. But even with these revelations, Judge Matthews couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. Was David truly a victim here, or had he simply fallen too far down a dangerous path? As the day wore on, the courtroom grew quieter. The defense had made its case, and the judge was left to process all the information that had been presented. David was still sitting there, staring at the table in front of him, his face a mask of exhaustion and regret. He didn't look like a man who had been living the high life. He looked like someone who had been running from something, someone who had been caught in a storm they couldn't escape. The trial was taking its toll on everyone. The witnesses for the prosecution had painted a vivid picture of a man who had knowingly stolen from those who trusted him. They described a person who had lied and manipulated his way through every stage of the business. And yet, Judge Matthews couldn't bring himself to fully believe it. He had seen enough people in his years on the bench to know that sometimes, appearances could be deceiving. By the end of the third day, Judge Matthews had seen the defense and prosecution present their strongest cases. The evidence was still stacked against David, but the possibility that he had been coerced into committing the crimes lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the idea that there was more to this case than just money. There was something personal about it, something deep that went beyond the surface of financial crimes. That night, after the courtroom had emptied out, Judge Matthews found himself alone in his chambers. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city lights below. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood once again. He remembered the summer days when he and David would sit in the park, talking about everything and nothing. Those days felt so far away now. What had happened to his friend? How had this all spiraled out of control? Judge Matthews closed his eyes and tried to piece together the timeline of David's life. He thought about the last time they had spoken, years ago. David had been excited about a new job opportunity, a chance to prove himself in the business world. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Was it possible that David had made bad decisions? Or had he truly been a victim of manipulation? As the judge sat there, trying to make sense of it all, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. His assistant entered, handing him a stack of papers. "Your Honor, there's an update on the case," she said, her tone serious. Judge Matthews nodded, feeling a sense of unease. He opened the file, scanning the documents quickly. Inside, there was new evidence. New witnesses had come forward. These witnesses had information about the people who had allegedly coerced David into committing the crimes. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and suddenly, things were looking different. The judge's heart raced as he realized that the case was far from over. There were more questions to be answered, and he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. But as he sat there, holding the evidence in his hands, he knew one thing for certain: this case was not what it seemed, and there was still so much more to uncover. And it all came rushing back. A flood of memories filled the judge's mind. He had seen that face before. That jawline, those eyes, that same crooked smile. He remembered it all so clearly. He froze for a moment, unsure if he was imagining things. But no, this wasn't a mistake. This man in front of him, the accused in a serious case, was none other than David Turner, his childhood friend. David had been a good kid back then. They had played together during their school days, spent afternoons at the local park, and shared stories about their dreams of the future. Back in those days, David was full of life, a bright young man with everything going for him. He had been the type of person you would expect to go on to do great things. They had lost touch after high school life had a way of pulling people in different directions. But here, in front of him, was David, now a man accused of a major crime. The next day, the courtroom was once again filled with the usual hum of chatter. Lawyers and witnesses moved through the room, preparing for the continuation of the trial. The audience took their seats, their eyes focused on the front of the room, waiting for the judge to enter. But for Judge Matthews, it was a day unlike any other. The shock of yesterday's discovery still lingered in his mind. As the courtroom quieted down and the bailiff called the court to order, the judge took his seat. His heart raced, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion, anger, and nostalgia. He couldn't seem to shake the memory of his old friend, David Turner, sitting across from him the day before. It had felt so surreal, like a dream that he couldn't wake up from. But this was no dream. David, his childhood friend, was in serious trouble, and now Judge Matthews had to decide what to do next. He glanced at the defendant's table, where David sat, his face still shadowed with guilt. He looked older now, weighed down by the years and the choices he had made. There was a new heaviness in his eyes, a look of someone who had seen things they could never forget. Judge Matthews felt a deep sadness for his old friend, but he had a job to do. He had to put those personal feelings aside and make sure that justice was served. But how could he be impartial? How could he look at the man who had been his friend, his companion, through some of the most carefree years of his life, and pretend that he didn't know him? Judge Matthews couldn't help but think back to their shared past. They had been close back then, inseparable, even. They had talked about everything, their hopes, their fears, and their dreams of the future. They had believed in the good in people, the idea that hard work and integrity would get them where they needed to be. But now, here they were, worlds apart. The man who had once been his closest friend was now facing charges that seemed impossible to reconcile with the memories the judge held. He tried to focus on the trial, but the words of the prosecutor seemed to float in and out of his mind. The details of the case were heavy. David had allegedly embezzled millions from a company he had worked for, leaving countless people without their savings. The evidence against him was damning, with financial records and witnesses who had testified about David's involvement in the scheme. The defense, however, was doing everything it could to poke holes in the prosecution's case, trying to prove that there was more to the story than what met the eye. But despite the arguments, Judge Matthews couldn't escape the reality of the situation. He was too conflicted. David had always been a smart guy, full of ideas and ambition. But the David sitting before him now wasn't the same person. The man who had once been hopeful and bright-eyed seemed broken, defeated by life. The more the trial unfolded, the more Judge Matthews began to wonder what had happened to his old friend. How had things gotten so out of control for him? Where had he gone wrong? Judge Matthews' mind kept drifting to the old days. He remembered the summer days when he and David would sneak out of their houses and explore the town, laughing at everything and nothing. They had been inseparable then. David had always been the more carefree of the two, the one who would talk about big dreams and adventures. Judge Matthews had always been the more reserved one, focused on his studies and what lay ahead. But they had balanced each other out. They had been a team. So, how had it all come crashing down? How had David ended up here, accused of such serious crimes? And more importantly, how had he not seen the signs? The judge looked over at David again, noticing the tension in his posture. David wasn't meeting his eyes. He had his head down, as if trying to hide from the world around him. He looked nothing like the young man Judge Matthews had known. There was a sense of defeat in his shoulders, a sadness that wasn't just about the trial, but about something deeper, something that had been festering for years. As the trial continued, Judge Matthews found it harder and harder to concentrate on the details. He would catch snippets of the testimony, how David had lived beyond his means, how he had manipulated the system to hide his thefts, and how his actions had caused so many people to lose everything. The more he heard, the more his heart sank. This wasn't the David he had known. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was piling up, and it was becoming harder to deny. The defense attorney, a woman named Sarah Clark, stood up to present her case. She was a sharp and seasoned lawyer, known for her ability to find cracks in any case. She approached the judge's bench with confidence, her heels clicking against the floor. She began speaking with calm precision, pointing out the flaws in the prosecution's case. She suggested that David had been manipulated by higher powers, that he had been coerced into committing the crimes by people who had more control over his life than anyone could imagine. Her words made Judge Matthews pause. Coerced? The idea that David had been forced into this life of crime was hard to believe. But as Sarah went on, something in Judge Matthews' gut told him that there might be more to the story. Could it be possible that David had been pushed into a corner, unable to escape? Could someone have taken advantage of his friend's vulnerabilities, leading him down this dark path? The thought made Judge Matthews' stomach twist. He knew that the law had to be fair, but fairness didn't always take into account the complexities of life. Sometimes, there were gray areas, and sometimes, people who seemed to be guilty on the surface had their reasons that couldn't always be explained by evidence alone. As Sarah's argument continued, Judge Matthews found himself torn between his duty and his memories. He had to make a decision. He couldn't let his feelings cloud his judgment. But how could he ignore the years of friendship he had shared with this man? Could he truly sentence someone he once called his closest friend? The trial raged on, but the emotional storm inside Judge Matthews only grew stronger. The weight of his own past clashed with his present responsibilities. He had to make sense of it all. He had to find a way to see the truth, no matter how hard it was to accept. As the day came to a close, Judge Matthews stood up and addressed the courtroom. His voice, though steady, carried the heaviness of the day. The decision he had to make was not going to be easy. And as he left the courtroom, his mind was no clearer than it had been at the start. But one thing was certain: this trial was not just about the law. It was about the man he had once known and the man he would have to judge. And that, in itself, was a challenge he had never expected to face. Judge Matthews could hardly believe his eyes. The room seemed to spin around him as he tried to grasp the reality of what was happening. How had David gone from that hopeful, energetic boy to a man standing trial for such serious charges? How could this person, who had been like family to him once, have found himself in this situation? His mind raced with questions, but before he could settle on an answer, the court began. The prosecutor began reading out the charges, but Judge Matthews barely heard the words. His thoughts were consumed with the image of the boy he once knew, the boy who had smiled in the schoolyard, who had joked with him about growing up and changing the world. The room fell silent as the defendant was led to the stand, the shackles around his wrists clinking with every step he took. He sat there, head lowered, his face shadowed. David didn't seem to be the same person anymore. He had aged, and there was a look in his eyes, a mixture of guilt and hopelessness that the judge hadn't seen in the past. "I never thought I'd see you here," Judge Matthews muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. He blinked a few times, trying to shake off the feeling. He had to do his job. He couldn't let his past interfere with the trial. The law had to come first, he reminded himself. But could he really separate his feelings from his duty? It wasn't just that he recognized the man in front of him. It was the deep, unresolved feelings of their shared past. How could he be impartial when his memories of David were so strong? His childhood friend, his teammate, the boy who had stood by his side through the toughest years. How could this person be capable of the crimes he was being accused of? The trial began formally, with the prosecutor outlining the charges and the evidence. As each piece of evidence was presented, Judge Matthews struggled to focus. The pictures of stolen funds, the accounts of betrayal, it all seemed so unreal. How could his friend, the person who had shared his hopes and fears, have done such a thing? How could someone so full of life have fallen so far? David's defense lawyer, a sharp woman with a calm demeanor, stood up to make her arguments. She tried to defend her client, questioning the prosecution's evidence and suggesting that there might be extenuating circumstances. But Judge Matthews barely heard her words. His mind kept drifting back to the past. David had always been a little rough around the edges, but he was never a criminal. At least, not in the way the law seemed to define him now. Judge Matthews could hardly believe that the boy he had known was now sitting in front of him, accused of such a betrayal. He felt a pang of guilt, as if he had somehow failed to see the warning signs, failed to reach out and offer a hand when it mattered. As the day went on, the trial progressed, but Judge Matthews was only half there. The man in the courtroom was no longer the person he remembered. The years had changed him, and the law had caught up with him. Still, a part of the judge refused to believe that his friend could be the person described by the prosecution. He wanted to believe there was more to the story. After a few hours, the trial was adjourned for the day, but the judge remained seated at his bench, staring at the empty chair where David had been sitting. His thoughts were clouded with confusion. What was the right thing to do? Could he separate his feelings for David from his responsibilities as a judge? Or was he, in some way, tied to the man he had once called a friend, unable to look past the memories they had shared? The courtroom cleared out, and the judge stood up, but he couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. This trial, this case, everything had just become so much more personal than he had ever imagined.